and welcome to the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology podcast. As usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and this week I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Kimberly Carfore. Kim, thanks for making time for us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, well, my pleasure. Among many other things, you teach in the world of religion, ecology, eco-psychology, nature immersion courses, all this stuff. But the reason I have you on now is because you're co-chairing the Religion Ecology unit for the American Academy of Religion, co-chairing it with Joseph Wiebe.
Yep.
And this was your inaugural year for the two of you to take over co-chairing. Before it was Christopher Carter, and of course he's still around and doing stuff with the unit, but you and Joe are really heading it up. So I figured it would be nice to hear about what happened at the American Academy of Religion annual meeting this November 2022. You never know; people could be listening in the distant future.
We hope.
2022. We hope in Denver, and so yeah, curious to hear a little bit about what was going on for folks who may have been at the conference but missed some of the religion ecology stuff, or folks like myself who weren't able to go at all. So happy to hear what exactly was the religion ecology unit up to this year.
Yeah, super happy to kind of give you the down low. So yeah, first of all, I'm glad that you mentioned Joseph Wiebe because he's not here right now. So I just want to give him a big shout out because, it's a lot of work to do behind the scenes and kind of, I feel very uh, proud of the work that we did, but we definitely are a team. And so I kind of want to give him a big old shout out at the beginning. Um, and so, well, another thing I kind of want to, another elephant in the room, at least to me, because you've had me on the podcast a couple times, I think we should tell the listeners, reveal a little something about us, that we're married. And so I don't know, maybe it's because of growing up in a big family. I always have this fear of too much favoritism. So I was very aware of that. Like, I don't want anybody to get mad that I'm on here all the time, but it's, we're married. And so we do this work together as well, in our own ways.
That's true, and it's very easy to schedule things with you
Yeah.
because we live together. And especially right now, I mean, the AAR happens always the week before Thanksgiving, and so getting anybody after Thanksgiving between then and the new year, not exactly easy to schedule. And
Yep.
there's certain times of the year where academics are just like, look, not now.
Yep.
And between the holidays and the fact that it's the end of the fall semester, there's grading and things like that.
Yep.
It's so complicated. So much easier to just kind of find a little bit of time with somebody who you happen to live with.
Yep.
So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. It's we're not shy about transparency here on the podcast. So
Transparency is a good thing.
yeah, I think so. Um, so yeah, people can inquire more about our personal relationship later. Uh,
Okay, transparency. I'll put my boundaries up. Not all trans, too personal questions.
yeah, that works. So yeah, what was going on? I know there were a lot of panels across the whole AAR because the theme this year was catastrophe, which of course evokes a lot of images and ideas of environmental catastrophes. But specifically, I'm curious, what was the religion ecology unit up to?
Yeah, so we had a sizable group of panels this year. And kind of like what you said, we got a lot of interest from people reaching out, interested in co-sponsoring with us because of exactly what you said, that this year's theme was catastrophe. And so I think a very obvious theme to a lot of us is climate catastrophe and ecological degradation. And so it was interesting for this to be our first year, because usually what they do with co-chairs is they'll stagger it. So this was a unique opportunity for both me and Joe to get on in the same year, and so we're kind of figuring things out together, and also having a lot of interest coming from other groups. So that was an interesting dynamic to juggle. But it was really exciting because there was so much interest. I feel like the panels were well attended, and that we got a lot of those panels. And so I think right now I'm just going to kind of go over a lot, all of them, to kind of, just like you said, to give everyone who wasn't able to attend a little bit of access into the kind of the dialogue and the discourse. And then as I'm talking, I just say like feel free to interrupt if you have any questions or comments or whatever. Because I'm just kind
Nice.
of gonna give the run through if that works for you.
Yeah, perfect. Sounds great.
Okay. Or if I just get sick of hearing my own voice, I'll just stop and then you can just say something.
That works too.
No, I'm just kidding. Okay, on Thursday or Friday, it started out was the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology uh, joint luncheon with the ISSRNC. So the ISSRNC is the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture. And so those are two of the religion and ecology groups, the two groups that are kind of defining the field. And so it was really neat because this year was the first year that they did a joint luncheon. Usually it's just held by the Religion and Ecology, the Forum on Religion and Ecology. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there because I had to teach, and so I showed up a little bit later. But I thought that that was a really great way to kind of start the conference, and it's sweet. It's very casual. People are encouraged to talk about who you are and what your interests are in the field, and maybe meet some new people. So it's just they're very much as like a social way to kind of to connect with people. And then our first actual panel was one that I presided over, which was really well attended. So that was really exciting. And it was on decolonization, traditional ecological knowledge, and care ethics. And so, kind of, there were four papers that just had uh, their own interpretation of those kind of those cross topics. And so, one thing, I mean, they're all really great papers and they gelled really well together, partly because the steering committee and the co-chairs work really hard on trying to create cohesive panels. But also because these scholars were very invested in the work. And that was something that really stood out to me throughout the whole conference. But a couple of phrases and ideas from that panel that I'm still grappling with in the best way, right? That's why we do these conferences, is for people to share knowledge. So Dr. Francis Flannery and Dr. Brian Colea did a joint paper, which I thought was also really brilliant, because oftentimes us as scholars, we do things very independently. And so even just doing a joint paper, I thought was really brilliant. But they talked about coral and how actually in the Hawaiian indigenous culture that coral came before the kind of like the lineage is coral, gods, and then humans, right? Because I think in religion and ecology, we're trying to rethink how climate change changes our ideologies, it changes our religions. But if you actually go back to certain traditions, they already have this very different lineage, right? So us and Western religions kind of follow that Platonic metaphysics, this cosmological order where humans are the pinnacle of creation. And so trying to rethink how actually material ecological beings preceded something even like God. I thought that was a really useful tool kind of to the field of religion ecology. And most of the papers talked about how kind of reframing our relationship to the material world is imperative to dealing with the climate crisis, right? So that was the first panel. And then the second one, so you already introduced Dr. Christopher Carter. So he was the previous Religion and Ecology co-chair. He's still on the steering committee, so he's been just so generous with his time to help me and Joe out to make sure that we're on the right, get off on the right foot. So we were really happy and honored to be able to offer him an entire panel dedicated to his most recent book, The Spirit of Soul Food. And so it was really beautiful because it was a chance for scholars to honor his work. And what really stood out to me was how soul food meets our current knowledge of structural racism, right? So as scholars, we're starting to unpack how structural racism is tied to the environmental crisis, and an intersectional approach sees those as inextricably intertwined. And so for Dr. Carter, he for him it's very personal, right? And so this whole panel was very personal. I haven't read the book, unfortunately. I hope to soon, but I think that the book is also very personal as well. And so it's his way of dealing with his own kind of environmental ethic when he kind of realized the inextricable dynamic of how American agriculture is built on the exploitation of Black and brown bodies, right? How can we and how to deal with that? And so for him, his work is reimagining soul food. And so one moment that really stood out, and this kind of ties back to how personal I think his project is, and he shared with the group that one of the hardest parts about writing this book is when he finished the book and it was through its editing process, and then one of the editors kind of pushed back and questioned his Blackness. And I think that kind of gets at the depth of how radical this project is, right? So once again, I felt very happy to have some very important scholars reading his work and critiquing his work. And I mean, there were more applause and critiques, but that's kind of that panel in a nutshell. And oh, go ahead. Were you going to say something?
Well, I was just gonna say that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was on the pod. He's been on the podcast a couple times. But the most recent time was talking about that book.
Oh,
So yeah,
got
The
you.
Spirit of Soul Food, great book. I'll have to put a link in the description for the episode and stuff so people can go back to that episode. So yeah, just great to see that book getting the scholarly recognition that it deserves, because it's a good book, but it's also a good conversation starter.
Right.
And yeah, really opens up a lot. I've introduced it to students, and yeah, you can tell that it just kind of opens people's eyes and like, oh, right, these connections are kind of right in front of us. But then once they're presented, you're like, oh, I didn't realize how serious it was and how
Right.
important the imperative to rethink our diets, rethink food production. Yeah, great.
Yeah. And we've had this conversation before, and I've thought about this a lot because I think one of the most interesting aspects of the field of religion ecology is, when you think about religion, you think about like ideologies and prayer, but then practice is kind of where the rubber meets the road. And I think that facing the environmental crisis is going to make us face the fact that we do have to change our practices. And so I think this is a really ripe example of how that translates and how actually difficult it is, because a lot of the time, like it's Christmas, it's the season of Christmas, and every year I think about how I feel it in my body, and I go out shopping and I have these traditional expectations, tradition to buy things, gifts for people, and spend money, but it's so wasteful. But then if you go against tradition, then you're seen as, I don't know, you get critiques and, oh, well, you're not participating in the tradition. So I think that there are a lot of different parts of our culture and our tradition that are going to have to change. And so I just think that that's a really great example and really kind of brave of him to just kind of do that. So that was that book panel. And then like I said, we did a lot of co-sponsored panels. And so our first co-sponsored panel was with the Buddhist philosophy unit. And so this was on Buddhist ethics, and Dan Capper had a book called Roaming Free Like a Deer, or Roaming Free. So I think it's Roaming Free Like Deer.
Right, that's great. Yeah, that was one that was really bummed to miss. I was actually teaching a Dan Capper book in a course this semester, a previous one, Learning Love from a Tiger. And so yeah, great work going on. So I'm curious, what's that panel about? What's that book about?
Yeah, so it talked a lot about relational animism. That was really the focus. And Usamu Pada, so interdependent co-arising. And so they just kind of unpacked what that actually means in an ecological context. So yeah, there was a lot of, it was very heavy on the Buddhist philosophy. And so, if you're not really in that world, that it was a little bit outside of kind of like the field of religion ecology, unless you do religion ecology and Buddhism. So very heavy on this idea of, so how does this belief in interdependent co-arising influence our ethics, ecological ethics? And so then the next one was another co-sponsored panel with the Indigenous Religions Traditions Unit. And, I don't know if this is just because this is really kind of where my research is, or if this was just a very exciting panel, but between this and the Christopher Carter, I feel like, as a unit chair, we want to see new ideas and taking the field in a creative direction. Kind of, you want to feel some sort of movement, like playing with the tradition, but also kind of moving in an interesting direction. And so I think that this co-sponsored panel really did that. And so once again, we focused a lot on decolonial approaches to religion and ecology. I mentioned that in the first independent panel, and then it comes up again in this co-sponsored panel. And so, for me, whenever I hear that word, I think a lot of the essay by Tuck-in Yang, Decolonization is not a metaphor. And so kind of that goes back to this idea that, we can change the facing the environmental crisis can change our ideologies or idea of what religion is, but it really comes down to the material practices, right? Like you can decolonize your mind, but decolonizing the land or decolonizing the texts, I think those are ways of engaging in kind of the field of religion ecology. And so a couple of the ideas and the topics that stood out to me in that panel. So here's an up and comer. I look out for this woman. Her name is Rebecca Mendoza Nunziato, and she only has a master's. I mean, not only, it's a amazing feat, right? But to be at this level of engaging the scholarship, it's exciting that she's just starting a PhD program. And so what she was doing was tracing Copal as an animate entity. And so, right, so she's kind of looking at Copal and how it gets co-opted into this extractive industry, extractive economy. And that's not separate from metaphysics, right? That the ideal is the real, right? And so following the material relations of Copal, and as it ties back into indigenous metaphysics. And so
I got to say, I know what Copal is and love it very much. For people who don't know what exactly it's a substance. It's like a resinous kind of substance or something. And I know it mostly from like incense and things like that. So worth mentioning. I'm not sure where the average listener or viewer is with knowing what Copal is.
right. So from my understanding, and I hope that I'm, I hope my understanding is correct, is that it comes from tree, like it's resin from the tree, and it's a sacred substance for some indigenous cultures. And so, it kind of reminds me of things like sage or some things that get really colonized and co-opted by kind of like white people, white spiritual circles. And so, people who don't understand the roots of this substance or the ritual that it belongs in kind of use it because they know it's sacred. And so that's kind of the colonizing practice is taking it, extracting it outside of its ritual context and performing, spiritual, I don't know, like for people who use sage, it's, I think people use it to cleanse their house or something like that. But yeah, so copal is resin from a tree. And it's kind of been co-opted by the extractive economy. So I hope that, does that help?
Yeah, no, that's good. I think anybody who's not familiar with it will now be like, oh, I should buy some and see how good it smells.
Yeah, no, it does
Uh,
smell really, really good. I
but
actually
that's
had
the
to,
problem then, right? Is that everybody's buying it. And so now it's the object of an extractive industry that's harming the ecosystems that produce it and the local communities for whom that's a sacred substance.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And so she was talking about how extracting it from its original community who knows how to use this in ritual and is doing that for, hundreds of thousands of years, how that actually is tied to like imprisoning of metaphysics. And so she uh, talked, she said that what she was doing was a process material metaphysics. That's what she labeled it as. And then she said, what is happening to this copal is epistemocide, right? So kind of like the genocide of epistemologies, right? Through the extracting of the material substance from its traditional culture and use. So it was just the way that she kind of wove. Usually when, a traditional scholarly paper, you have your kind of very linear argument, very logical, very rational. But this had a very artful weaving of story, and it's hard to put my finger on when you
That's
ever,
good.
do you ever feel like when you're listening to a presentation and you arrive at a conclusion and you can't really articulate it, but you just feel like you were kind of, the story led you to like an epiphany? That was kind of what I.
That's great. Yeah, I'll have to be in touch and see if we can get her on the show. Yeah, super, super curious about the details of all that. And just, yeah, that kind of metaphysical thinking. That's always one of those things I'm happy to hear more of in the field of religion ecology is people working on these kind of philosophical foundations of the field, getting into the epistemology, the metaphysics, etc. So
Right.
yeah, no, that's exciting, exciting work.
Yeah, it's almost like telling the story of Copal, right? So as Copal became enslaved and extracted, so did indigenous metaphysics and lifeways, right? Because there's that saying that we must breathe life into these lifeways, right? And so if you're not kind of breathing into those metaphysical relations, then they can go extinct, right? So I just think it was a really artful way to demonstrate that without being too bogged down in kind of the jargon of everything. So then another, really, really, I made a note. I was hoping that you could have these people on your podcast as well. So back to Dr. Flannery and Dr. Colia. So they they talked about coral again. So they were actually in two of the panels.
Oh,
Yeah. But this one, so it's important to note that Dr. Flannery and Dr. Colia, so they're scholars of the Hebrew Bible, right? And so they're trying to connect their scholarship, their very rigorous scholarship, with kind of like the Hawaiian culture and traditional Hawaiian cultures. And so a couple things that really stood out that made me think uh, is they said that in the Bible, God as rock, or God is rock, was mentioned 48 times. But then God is Father was only mentioned 4 times, right? So this is kind of back to this idea of breathing life into these metaphysics, right? So how did this idea of God the Father, which is only actually mentioned 4 times in the Bible, how did that become the dominant narrative, right? So that's how these ideologies are tied to the material world. And so I just thought that was really, it was another epiphany moment, like, oh yeah, so in the Hebrew Bible, God is rock, right? Kind of like Pierre Terre Desjardins, the the eco spirituality. It's not it's right there, right? It's not some new age idea. It's very traditional, right? If you actually go back and do the work of translation. And so I thought that was also just such a beautiful gift to the field of religion and ecology, right? Because oftentimes in Christianity, you hear, even for me when I teach my theology classes, I'll usually ask students, what are some metaphors that you have that you grew up with or that you've heard? What is God? And so you'll get, God the Father, God is my shepherd, but I'll always, God is love. But I always get someone saying, God is my rock. But I thought it was so interesting because that's so anthropocentric. No, actually, in the Bible, it says God is rock. It's not God is my rock, God is rock. So,
Right. Yeah. Even my rock is a little anthropocentric. Yeah. It's a good point. Just thinking about rock in itself versus thinking about rock for us. Yeah, that's very good. And that's one of those things I always encourage people to actually read the Bible because there's a lot in there beyond our inherited prejudices and assumptions, conditioned after thousands of years of that text being around and going through
right.
translations and interpretations. And yeah, when you really look in there, you're like, oh, God isn't just the white man in the sky, which is really more of a Zeus. Although
Yeah.
even Zeus is the thunder, he's the eagle. Even Zeus, right, isn't just a white guy in the sky. So yeah,
Yeah.
such a strange image that's actually quite foreign to the biblical understanding. So yeah,
I mean
that's a
that
good one.
Yeah, I mean that was tied the image of God the Father is tied to the Sistine Chapel, right? The Michelangelo.
Yeah,
Mm.
so we might want to blame Michelangelo for that a lot. I'm not sure. That's a good point though. Yeah, so you're thinking, the Renaissance really is when that starts to get driven home. And yeah, it took a while. So I would think for most of the ancient medieval mind, they really weren't as anthropocentric as we think.
Yeah.
Yeah, Platonists, the Christians, Jews, like no, it's dig into those texts. They're not as anthropocentric as we think.
Yeah.
So Lynn White's piece, kind
Yeah.
of on the historic roots or ecological crisis, like it's not so simple.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, it also makes you rethink because was it Thomas Berry that said we should put the Bible back on the shelf for the next 100 years?
Maybe, yeah.
It's like, well, maybe we should have scholars like this reinterpret the Bible.
Yeah, and look at it with fresh eyes. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's one of the exciting things that's continually happening with the Religion Ecology unit at the AAR. One of the great reasons to keep coming back to those panels. You just, even if you're deeply involved with looking at biblical studies, you still see people who are like, oh, but you haven't looked at this angle.
Mm,
So yeah, that's a good one. I appreciate, especially because in terms of the old, great chain of being,
right.
rocks were really at the bottom of the bottom.
Yep.
And it's one thing to be like inanimate matter, but even then, fire and wind and water at least can move. And
Oh,
rocks are just
yeah.
motionless. They're the bottom of the bottom. They just sit there. They move if you kick them or whatever. If the wind blows a rock or something, if water erodes water, then rock might move. But yeah, rock seems to have no agency of its own. So then to redeem that as divine is significant. We had David Haberman on the podcast a while back because he has a book, Loving Stones, which is all
Mm,
about looking at stones in Hinduism and the way in which a mountain can be Krishna. And
mm,
so yeah, important to pay attention to stones. They're
yeah.
so forgotten. And it's like, well, once we recover the bottom of that hierarchy that normally
Right.
goes from matter to life to humans to gods, angels in there somewhere, but stone is at the bottom. So if we rethink stone, we're rethinking the whole game.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So that kind of brings me to the final panelist, James Waters, who who talked about Christian animism. And so also just kind of affirming that these ideas are not far from the actual tradition, that animism is kind of the it's right there. And yeah, as you were talking about rocks, it's just so sad, I was thinking about how the metaphor when you're, not intelligent, someone will say, "Oh, you're dumb as rocks." It's like, well, that's so not what what is the truth? It's far from the truth, right? It's just, from our anthropocentric perspective, and that great chain of being, that because rocks can't move and they're said to not have something like a mind, um, they don't kind of like grow things, or maybe the pace that they grow is so far from the pace that humans are used to seeing or measuring things by intelligence or growth or things like that, that ends up being at the very bottom of our great chain of being, but is actually, what we wouldn't be here if we didn't have rock. I mean, we're living on a rock. The rock is our foundation.
Yeah, and yeah, I feel that's the case. Anytime somebody uses a non-human entity to try and insult a human, it often belies a deep misunderstanding of the nature of that non-human entity.
That's
Like
true.
bird brain is another one. Like, no, I
Yeah.
mean,
Oh,
corvids in particular are
corvids.
especially intelligent, or even pigeons, right? Or people following blindly like sheep. Like, no, sheep actually have a lot more intelligence and they navigate their situations with much more kind of vigilance. They're not just like blindly following. So yeah,
No.
the dumbest rocks is really up there for like, oh, that's a misplaced insult. I'd love to
Oh
be as
yeah.
intelligent as a rock.
I know the longevity, they've
Yeah,
stuck around. Like rocks have been there since the very beginning. In the
yeah,
very beginning of time, for that matter.
maybe. I'm not sure. It depends
Yeah,
when
that's
time
actually
begins. Yeah, the Great Fireball, 13.8 billion years ago, there wasn't really any stable
there wasn't,
matter at
yeah,
all. It
that's
took a
true.
minute for atoms to form. Rocks would have formed much later.
Fair.
But but yeah, they're early in any case.
Earlier than humans is all I'm trying to
Yeah,
say.
much. Yeah, much.
Oh. Yeah, so it kind of just reminds me of how doing this work, I think one of the most beautiful moments is when the great chain of being gets flipped on its head, right? I know that like when reading Braiding Sweetgrass, I had that moment where these are our ancestors, the rocks are our ancestors, thinking about it in terms of that we rely on the rocks maybe more than they rely on us.
Yeah, hard to imagine a world where there's humans and no rocks, but there's definitely been a world where there's rocks and no humans. So yeah, in
Yeah,
terms of that basic dependency, somebody's got some priority there.
yeah.
That's great, and I appreciate the attention to animism as well. Speaking just of other people we've had on the podcast, very recently, Rowan Deere was talking about her book, Radical Animism,
Oh
and
yeah.
looking at Copernicus, Darwin, Freud, Jacques Derrida, and reading them with and against literary figures like Shakespeare and Virginia Woolf and Lewis Carroll, Franz Kafka. So really great book, and just for me personally, I'm happy to see this kind of ongoing resurgence of animism. It's been happening for years, but definitely seems like it's picking up steam lately. So yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah. And really important too, because I think for a while, ever since I started serving on the steering committee of the Religion and Ecology unit here, we have been very adamantly trying to be more inclusive and less, Christocentric, because the field of religion and ecology it's just really easy to fall back into kind of Christianity as like the main religion that we're all referencing. Um, so going back to this idea of even reframing Christianity as intrinsically animistic, I think is just a really, it's a cool direction, like kind of regrounding the tradition in that way.
Yeah, yeah, I think it might be Mark Wallace who was one of the really big pioneers in that regard. Pioneer being a terrible metaphor, uh, a good colonial metaphor for something animism, which is essentially, really has a problematic history in terms of that.
Right,
Early anthropologists using the term animism were very much into a colonial attitude, so we really need to
right.
reclaim animism from that. So sorry to Mark for using the term pioneer. But yeah, I'm sure his work was probably part of the inspiration behind that piece.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's beautiful. So, let's see, a couple other things. Another direction that we have been wanting, kind of going back to this idea that we're trying to make it more inclusive and less Christianity centric. We had a panel on Islam and ecology, and unfortunately, I couldn't make it to that one, so I don't know the kind of the ins and outs. I don't have like epiphany moments or quotes. but uh, we were really happy about this collaboration because of trying to build the field and think about new metaphors and include them in different scriptural readings. So that was another panel. It's so funny. I'm having a hard time moving on from this conversation of Roxy because I think it's so interesting. I kind of want to keep going, but hopefully, you'll be able to kind of do that in a different podcast, kind of continue
Yeah,
on
there
this
will always be more
conversation.
to say about rocks. Yeah, they've come up a lot, and really all the classical elements, But yeah, something special about stone, rocks. So yeah, it'll come up. Yeah, and that's the tough thing about summarizing all the stuff that happens, at a conference like this is each piece is really so deep. Even when somebody gives like a
Yeah.
20-minute paper, that 20-minute paper is often the tip of an iceberg of a lot of research. So even one of
Yes.
those papers becomes so much, each panel is so much more.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are all really terribly unjust summaries of stuff that deserves much more attention. But that's the idea, is basically just giving people a kind of really rough summary, just like if you go online and try to look up a summary of an interesting movie or something, and you're like, oh, those two paragraphs probably didn't do it justice. It gives you a
Yeah.
sense of what's out there. And so yeah, I'm just hope that listeners and viewers get a sense of the kind of stuff that the Religion Ecology unit has been up to, and they can
Nice.
ferret out some of these things on their own time. Google is your friend.
Google's your friend. Well,
uh,
and also,
YouTube also.
that's true. And I think that, I mean, if you, how could you do this? I know that this is public information, like these panels. So if something sparks your interest and I didn't get into it, you can just kind of go on Google or find the what do you call it? The handbook or the schedule.
Right. Or find us. I've mentioned a handful of times in the last, I don't know, 2.5 years that we've been doing this podcast, that I'm around, I'm available. So if anybody ever has questions about the material that we cover, they can always reach out to me. Because you
Oh,
never know.
easy.
Something, especially, American Academy of Religion is not all about just giving away everything for free. There's membership dues, etc., conference
Yeah.
registration fees. And so sometimes access to these program books is actually not fully available for everybody.
Oh, so it isn't public information.
No, some of it is, some of it's not, and so yeah. So for anybody who wants more info, I'll make sure that they know they can get a hold of us, especially you and Joe co-chairing the unit. I'm sure you'll be happy to be a liaison between any interested parties
Yeah,
who are like, oh,
definitely.
what was this Islam and ecology panel? Connect me with those folks, and
Yeah.
yeah, we can do that connecting work. That's what we're here for. That's the podcast in a nutshell. That's the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, trying to be a hub to
Yeah.
connect people to the vast amount of research that's being done. So much more than people know. So many people despairing about our response to environmental issues, and they don't realize how much great work is being done. Like, yeah, things are
Yes.
getting worse in so many respects, but at the same time, things are getting better. People are devoting a lot of time and energy
Yeah.
to rethinking these things in a deep way.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'll make sure that that's clear in the
Perfect.
ever important description beneath the episode. For more
Yeah.
information, here's how you can reach us.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I want to make sure that if you're interested in some of the panels that I couldn't go to, I could at least give you the names and of the people and their
Yeah.
paper titles. I could give you the abstracts and maybe even contact information if you want to collaborate with them or something like that. So yeah, I like that you brought that up.
Well, so were those all the panels from this year?
Well, there was one more, and once again, because I had to fly home because I had to teach, but so I couldn't be at this final panel, but it was on conversion and aesthetics. And so I thought a couple of really interesting points that the papers tackled uh, were how one paper talked about how environmentalists' emphasis on conversion may actually increase polarization, like political polarization. So I thought that was really interesting and important to bring up, right? Because, I really appreciate how scholars say, everybody should go vegan, but that might actually, when you look at it politically, that might actually be kind of co-opting the movement in a way where it's kind of deadlocked and not moving forward, right? So that's kind of just one example. And then the other focus was on this idea of the trivialization of beauty. And so kind of what that made me think of was how environmentalists have this focus on, you know, saving our species, like saving the human species, or saving species from going extinct, rather than this idea of enhancing the beauty of our landscapes. Like, what if we just reframed it in that way? It kind of reminds me of, if people's response to COVID, well, they'd say, some people would say, well, I don't care, I've had a good run. And so how COVID got framed in this terms of life or death, when actually it's like, well, maybe we just don't want to spread this virus because we don't want to have to deal with it for, the rest of, our lives as humans. And so kind of using that metaphor, the COVID metaphor, thinking back on how that relates to kind of the environmental crisis is, even in my lifetime, I've noticed that landscapes have gotten less beautiful because the biodiversity has gone down. And like, isn't that enough? Shouldn't that be enough to where we should act? Like, don't we just want our environment, the landscapes, to be more beautiful? Or how can we make these landscapes more beautiful? Because I feel like, right now, if we teach about climate change or environmental degradation or species extinction, one of the reasons people shut down is because of the doom and gloom. And so kind of thinking about reframing it in terms of aesthetics might be a way to kind of reframe the discourse. So yeah, I feel like that panel was very much about reframing and how maybe different ways that we can rethink these arguments.
That's good. Well,
Yeah.
geez, speaking of people's response to COVID, I know there have been some criticisms of the AAR's response, and they're doing their best, of course. But I heard from you in particular that at the Denver meeting in November that there wasn't a lot of mask wearing, and who knows, everybody might have been vaccinated or whatever, but of course, you kind of want as much protection as possible, especially when so many people traveling from different parts of the country, different parts of the world, the whole planet. I know somebody who's coming in from Indonesia, and so
Yeah.
it's like, all right, there's a lot of different vectors from different communities all kind of intersecting here. So it's a little dangerous. So I wonder if you want to share your experience about the kind of lack of mask wearing.
I mean, yes and no. I don't want to share my experience, but I think it's important. So yeah, I was hoping that there was gonna be a lot more mask wearing. I would say maybe around, on any given day, 5 to 10% of the people in the conference were wearing masks. Um, and I know of a handful of people who got COVID, including myself. And it was a little frustrating because, I've been so careful and haven't traveled, and this was the first time. Like, I was like, well, I gotta go. Like, I want to be there, do my job, and do my service. And excited to see people. But yeah, it seems kind of, I've been so careful for almost 3 years now, and then this is, the one time I go out, and it's for work. Um, and so I got COVID. So I'm hoping that number one, next year, I'm assuming it's going to be in person again next year. I'm hoping that more people wear masks because of like what you said, like it is an internationally known conference. People come in from all over the world. People come in from all over the country, and we don't know, how vulnerable those communities that those people are going to go back to, their families or their schools or whatnot. So I'm hoping that next year there will be a little bit more people wearing masks, if not for themselves, for other people.
Right. And as I understand it, one of the ways they're also going to kind of be more protective of people's health is to reintegrate some online offerings, some remote offerings in the conference. Because, of course, back in 2020, it was like a fully remote conference. And then they were kind of like trying to get past that, get back to in person, because, of course, we all love being in person.
Yeah.
But it sounds like next year there will be a little more of a hybrid element to it.
Yeah, at the meeting, the program unit chairs meeting, there's talk of having hybrid options. And so we don't know the outcome of those decisions yet, but there's definitely talk of that, which I think is really impressive and important because of kind of the issue of inclusivity. I would love to see more graduate students there, but anyone who's been a graduate student, for the most part, it's financially very difficult. And so, I think that's a really great way to include graduate students and get more people from different countries or different areas to be a part of the dialogue, is to include those the online offerings. So, like I said, we don't know yet, but there's definitely talk.
Yeah, that's great. And that's a good point. Even aside from COVID, there are things like the financial commitment, and for grad students or for a lot of adjuncts or people who aren't paid in academia at all. Some people are just interested in these things for scholarly reasons, but
Yes.
aren't don't have any kind of funding. And then likewise, yeah, getting a more international or global kind of cooperation would be much easier with some remote offerings. So yeah, we'll see. That's complicated. Well, I'll tell you, speaking of what's coming up, really great to hear of all these panels this year. Really exciting. Though it kind of made me feel even worse for missing out on it because there's so much great stuff. But I am curious if you could tell us just briefly, you don't have to go into too much detail, what's the Religion and Ecology unit looking forward to? You gave us a nice review of this year.
Mm.
What's a little bit of a preview of the kind of stuff coming out next year? I guess the call for papers officially comes out in like what, February or something?
Oh, I should know
Or
this date.
January
Yeah.
maybe?
Yeah.
And normally due sometime in March? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Yep.
know it's kind of coming soon. So yeah, what's can you give us a little bit of a teaser of what's the religion ecology unit looking forward to in the future?
I'll give you a little spoiler. Yeah, so every year we have a general theme that's given to us by the president of the
Right.
AAR. And so, us as chairs and steering committee will decide, like, oh, based upon that theme, what are some directions that we specifically see or desire our fields to move in within that kind of context. And so the general presidential theme is La labor de nuestras manos. And so the labor of our hands. And so to me, that's, rethinking the study of religion as not just this idea, but as the work of our hands. Um, Thinking it as like a material and embodied practice. And so for the field of religion and ecology, we're thinking, well, we have some interest in co-sponsored panels, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But in general, we're thinking about, climate protests, this idea of civil disobedience, people who are actually on the ground and engaging in climate change, whether that's, vulnerable communities or people who are, like I said, like activists. And also kind of rethinking whose labor do we benefit from. And so the conference is going to be in San Antonio, Texas, and so we're really thinking about kind of like interest in engaging in Latin American scholars or uh, scholarship in that area. And so we have, like I said, we have a few co-sponsored panels. And so the first one is the women of with the women of color in scholarship. And so we were thinking about kind of what I like to call community engaged learning. How well, that was just kind of my interest in it. So who's, like I've already said, whose labor do we benefit from, and thinking about the global south, and how do our relationships inform our pedagogy, or how does it inform our scholarship. And then the next co-sponsored panel is with the philosophy of religion unit. And so I think it was 10 years since the passing of Bruno Latour.
Oh, he
And
just passed away a few weeks ago. I think it was 10 years since the publication of his book on Gaia, perhaps. That was
oh, that's
probably the
what it
thing. Yeah.
is.
No, he
Yeah, that's
recently
the thing.
passed, though, also. And we did a little
Ah,
in memoriam for him on the podcast here just about a month ago or so. So
oh,
yeah, but I'm sure
beautiful.
between his recent passing and the 10-year anniversary of the Gaia book, Facing
Yeah.
Gaia. So yeah, that's exciting. I like that a lot. I mean, I've always been very partial to the intersection of philosophy with religion and ecology. So happy to see those two units thinking of something. And Bruno
Mm.
Latour, of course, yeah, so much to offer that intersection.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, so I guess if someone who's listening listen to the in memoriam and then engage the scholarship and then submit a idea to the CFP. Well, good. That's exciting. And so then the final co-sponsored panel is with the native traditions in the Americas. And so once again, we're thinking about vulnerable communities. We're thinking about how Indigenous communities are engaging in the work of climate justice. And yeah, back to this idea of climate protest. And so, that's once again, I don't have the call for papers memorized. That's a very broad and brief, quick and dirty overview of the CFP. There's a lot more details, and I think the reason that we write these and we try to have as many prompts and questions as possible is because we want to kind of spark uh, creative modes of thinking, or give you an idea of the different directions that we're interested in going. But one thing I want everybody to know is that, if you have an idea that's not on the call that fits in the field of religion ecology, please send it along, because we're two people with 8 steering committees. We're not, everybody, the field of religion ecology is interdisciplinary, it's very broad. And so we do really welcome new engagements in the field, creative directions, or something we may not have been thinking about. So yeah, so that's kind of the general call for papers for next year.
Nice. Yeah, thanks for the preview. And
Yeah,
yeah, for anybody who's thinking of submitting stuff, hopefully this is a little bit helpful to kind of start priming their thinking. I know for me, definitely, I'm very much thinking about submitting to that Bruno Latour panel,
great.
just because his thought has definitely meant a lot to me over the years. So yeah, hopefully we'll be seeing some folks in San Antonio in November of
Yeah,
2023. The distant future, it seems.
it does seem like the distant future. Yeah, it'll be here before we know it, though. It always is.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully you can be there next year. So I know that you were unable to come to the AAR this year, unfortunately, and you were actually going to present a paper there, which was very interesting and exciting. So it's unfortunate that you were unable to do that. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, I was really disappointed to have to. I canceled, not long before the conference happened. Yeah, just too many things came up personally and professionally. I was just a little too overwhelmed to make it happen. So, yeah,
yeah,
really sorry to do that.
happens. Well, maybe you can give us a little preview or a little insight into what you're going to talk about.
Yeah, yeah, I'd be happy to. Um, I mean, for this episode, I really just wanted to hear about what the Religion Ecology Unit was doing. And so you gave a really great review, a good preview of what's to come in 2023. So I'll tell you what, we'll chat for a little bit about it, but I'll make that a separate episode. So for now, I'll go ahead and say bye to all the people tuning in. We'll be back with another episode soon. And if you want to hear more about what I was going to present, which surely was the most important thing at the whole conference, groundbreaking work. And so yeah, if you want to hear a little bit more of that, then yeah, I'll see you on our next episode soon. So in the meantime, thanks for being here. Thanks for listening or viewing or however you're paying attention. And we'll see you again soon. So take care and be well.
Bye, everyone.